to go ahead with this, with the money when they require it, and saying, look, poor guys, they've lost their subsidy. I'm not saying you're doing a bad job on all the stuff that you say about the fares, etc., but why are you giving them money? What are you requiring in exchange? You're getting transparency from them. Do you know what's happening in the CIE accounts internally? The company's a shambles. We all know that. And it's not just because it's making a loss.
In trying to answer what our role is.
Yeah, but you can't be giving public money to the company if it's not performing its own duties. You've got an overall role there. You're a regulator as well, aren't you?
We give public monies to CIE because it meets all its service requirements in its contract with us. That's why we give the monies to them, and they won't get the monies if they don't meet the service requirements. So that's the primary obligation. And then we only approve fares increases if we're satisfied that there's a need to improve those fares increases because the alternative of cutting services because a change of costs or revenue basis would occur. That's our primary function. The primary function of government as a single shareholder is to manage the company. If we were in contract with, say, for example, a multinational operator from abroad, we wouldn't be managing their internal accounts. We'd be managing the interface with us, which is the provision of services according to contract, and then any applications for fare increases.
Let me get this right then. You have 265 million to give to CIE, one way or the other. How they manage their own internal accounts is really irrelevant to you. Is that what you're saying?
To the extent, only to the extent that it has an impact on the services or the fares or the discharge of their obligations. To that extent, yes, of course. We review all those matters, and then we require reporting to us on cost control, staff numbers control, payroll costs, all those issues when we're looking at a fares increase. And we brought in our external auditors, Farrell Grant Sparks, to devise a template reporting mechanism which we apply across all the operators on how they report their projections, their cost control, the revenue basis, and all their extraordinary costs before we consider fares increases.
Well, what do you think of the fact that they couldn't produce their accounts on time, consistently?
Well, I think those are separate matters to they're separate matters to their obligation to us under contract. There's no obligation under us to contract about their duty as a semi-state body regarding accounts, etc. So the obligations to us under contract about the service and the provisions that they have to do and the information that they give us. And they've satisfied all those obligations. And we audit also the CIE for. We audit the capital spend. We audit that we're satisfied that the monies that we give them on the capital side has been appropriately spent and they have a proper controls and procurement systems. And we audit the subsidies to them to make sure that there's proper separation of accounting from any of their commercial activities. For example, Bus Éireann runs Expressway, Irish Rail runs Rosslare Harbour and Freight, and also tracks back that they have reported their operating data appropriately to us.
So it really, CIE can do what it likes outside your remit, and you give them the 265 million.
Well, I think.
I mean, what do you think of their accounts? What do you think of their accounts? The absolute pantomime of the CIE accounts this year and every other year, and you're giving them this sort of money. Would you not say, no, you're not getting this money until you put your accounts in order? Well, you're giving this money. It looks to me, I mean, they got their fare increase very, very easily. You give them a fare increase, and you give them the 265 million, and they can't even keep their own house in order, and their auditors are qualifying their accounts. You're a kind of sugar daddy. What do you think of the fact that they can't produce accounts on time?
I'm not going to comment on their accounts.
You're giving them 265 million.
It's not material to the giving of 265 million and the discharge of the services that they're required to under contract. The key thing is that for us as a body, and that for us coming before this committee is, do we implement the contract, do we monitor the contract, and do we make payments if they haven't satisfied their obligations? And we don't make payments if they haven't satisfied their obligations.
Do you have any role in advising the Department of Transport on this?
We simply advise the Department of Transport on what might be the appropriate levels of subsidy for public transport if we want to grow public transport in the state. We did that in 2011 when they were looking at the programme of current expenditure out over a number of years. But the Department of Transport manages the finances of the companies as companies because they're the shareholder, and there's a separation. Then we manage the delivery of services that they give to the state for the money
So you
that they're
put
given.
up money for the services regardless of their behaviour elsewhere, regardless of the state of their accounts.
Well, I suppose the primary manifestation of the companies is their performance. The primary manifestation is the performance of every day of bus and rail services. And in that regard, they have met all the performance requirements.
It must be pretty limited. Must be a very low bar. What about the LEAP card? Is it fully integrated yet?
Yes.
It is.
Well, it's
Fully integrated.
Well, it's integrated across Dublin Bus, Irish Rail, and Lewis. At the moment, we're piloting it on private bus operators, Wexford Bus, Matthews, and we're installing it on Swords Express. And then we're going within the next 2 weeks a pilot on Bus Éireann in the Eastern region. So I would see by the summer you will have all the Bus Éireann services in the Eastern region in, and you will have a number of private operators in.
How much did it cost? It took about 10 years to come into existence, didn't it?
It took from the conception from 2001, 2002, it took 10 years to, approximately 10 years to its launch. 55.4 million was the budget that was set. The Controller General.
For what? 55 million for a card?
55 million for all the back office development, the
What's that mean?
technical design. Well, this card has to integrate the ticketing
55
systems.
million over 10 years to produce this.
That's right.
What do you think of that?
Well, I've looked at other systems. For example, the London system cost 1 billion. Ottawa cost, which, is costing similar monies. Any kind of city of our size would be in the order of 50 to 100 million. So,
Over 10 years. It takes 10 years, doesn't it?
Now the time frame, I'm not going to comment that, that any great records were set in the delivery of the LEAP card.
What do you think of that time frame?
Well, I think that there was 6 years lost, essentially. The project started out in 2001, 2002. There was an attempt to do a procurement for the whole package, design and operation, everything, which collapsed in 2005. And because they couldn't find throughout the world, they couldn't find a person who wanted to take all the design functions, the back office function, integration functions, and then do the operation. They couldn't find a satisfactory partner in that regard.
Which was wasted then?
Well, I can't comment on that. I'm unfamiliar with that. What I do know is that really the project got reconstituted in 2007. The department set up a non-statutory board and brought in an ex-secretary general to chair the board to drive the project forward. They redefined the project. They created a new business case, and on the basis of a new business case, they set a new budget, set 55.4 million as the budget in 2008, and it has been delivered for that. So
this is a project where there was massive waste.
I wouldn't say there was massive waste, but I would say there was a delay because the first concept of the project didn't get delivered, so it had to move into a second phase.
That massive waste, you'd call it delay. Okay, that's fine. I mean,
the bulk of the expenditure occurred post the kind of reconstitution of the project. And I suppose the other factor was that they set up a non-statutory body, and one of the reasons for setting us up as a body was to give us statutory powers across all these operators to require integration and to drive forward integration. And then that function was moved across to us in September 2010, and I'm pleased to say that we delivered the project in December 2011.
okay, I mean, I can't, I'll stop now, Chairman, but I can't understand how you could operate in this extraordinary vacuum of giving vast sums of money to CIE, which can't even produce proper accounts. And you say, okay, this is a satisfactory arrangement, when this company not only can't produce proper accounts, waste money willy-nilly on LEAP cards, which took 10 years to produce and cost 55 million, operates in a secret way, has been found to have been corrupt by some auditors and buried the report, which cost $500,000. And I think the taxpayer should rely on you to come out and say, and put up the red flag and say CIE is a shambles. And we don't think we should be giving them this amount of money. Tell me, okay, you're paid a lot of money. How much how many people in your organisation are paid over 100,000?
Let me see now if I can find those figures for you.
Anyway, it's the CIE.
Sorry. I think I just have a figure here. So. Yes, we have 8 individuals paid over 100,000.
Paid over 100,000, okay.
Right.
Anybody paid over 150,000 besides yourself?
Just myself.
Just you? Okay, that's fine. Okay, that's fine, Chairman, thank you.
Just on a point of clarification, Mr. Murphy, in relation to the cost of the leave card, you said that the leave card budget was 55 million. Is that correct? That's not the total cost.
It is the total cost, yes.
For what period does that cover?
That covers the period of from 2007 up to today.
But what happened to the cost from 2001?
I'm unaware of those costs. I don't have that information.
But it did cost substantial money from 2001 to 2007.
There would have been costs in that period, which would have been technical development work that would have rolled into the next project, but I really don't want to hazard a guess at the figures there.
Who would have those costs then?
Those costs would be available from the Department of Transport.
100 million?
No, it wouldn't have been 100 million. No.
Okay, what could it be? Ballpark?
I think it would be staff project management costs, maybe some support legal costs. It's definitely not the equivalent of the budget for the whole project. That's why I say it couldn't be 100 million, because the budget for the whole project is 55 million. And I don't want to really hazard a figure. I can provide the figure afterwards. I can go to the Department of Transport and find what the figure was. It was many years before our establishment.
See, we're going to have the Department of Transport in, I think, in 2 weeks' time for the information of the members. And what concerns me about your organisation and others is that you begin to account for yourself, and rightly so, from the date you were established and so on. But to get the other costs, then we have to go elsewhere. I think that as the Chief Executive Officer of NTA, you should at least have some historical background, particularly in relation to LEAP and the costs. So I would suggest that maybe you should furnish the costs from 2001 onwards, even if it has to come from the department, so that the committee members are informed, because it isn't 55 million. It is 55 million from the time of your watch, but there are other costs associated with the LEAP project from 2001 onwards.
Yes, and I'll do so.
Thank you. Deputy
Chairman, can I just ask one quick question about the leap card and how many are being used at the moment, and how successful is it?
Well, there are 210,000 LEAP cards issued, and there are about 1.5 million journeys a month being made on them. It's exceeded targets. We anticipated the first 12 months, we're at 13 months about, the first 12 months we'd have about 150,000 cards, so we exceeded the targets on that.
And that's entirely in Dublin, isn't it?
That's right, yes. And what we're looking at now is a programme to looking at the opportunities for expansion to Cork and Galway.
Okay, thank you.
Is that okay, Deputy Murphy?
Thank you, Chair, and thank you, Mr. Murphy, and your colleagues for coming in today. Just staying on the leave card for a moment and separating it out from the costs and the project overruns that have happened, I think it is a great thing to have in the city now, finally. And I understand it's to be extended to Dublin bikes on a trial period. Is that correct?
Not necessarily. That's a system controlled by JC Deco, who offer it.
Is it something you're looking at?
We were looking at it with JC Deco, yes, but it haven't come to a conclusion on that, nor has Dublin City come to a conclusion with their negotiation with JC Deco and even extending the bike scheme.
No, does that come under your authority, the Dublin bike scheme, at all?
Well, it comes as something that we're going to fund the next stage, yes. Yeah.
You're funding the next stage?
Yes, we'll fund it.
I know that there's some money was released from the government for, I think it was pre-planning and that kind of aspect of the actual scheme, but my understanding was the delivery of bikes and the actual stations, that still is to maintain with JC to go, is that correct?
That's right. It's a proprietary system, so the extension of it will be through JC Deco. Dublin City Council negotiating with them about the extension. There'll be insufficient advertising revenue to support the extension, and that's why there needs to be a state intervention. That state intervention will come through funds that we provide to Dublin City Council.
Have you an idea of how much that's going to cost?
We've set aside $2.5 million this year if there's successful negotiations, and I think perhaps it's in the order of $5 million. The phase extension down to Docklands and to Houston Station, but this year we can only provide $2.5 million. We've set aside $2.5 million to go into
For 2013?
For 2013.
Or 2.5 for 2014?
Yes.
Okay, and the negotiations have been going on for quite a while now, haven't they?
They have, yes. I mean, if you recall, the way the Dublin Bike Scheme was set up was that there was advertising rights secured by JC Deco on the basis of giving social community facilities. The Dublin Bike Scheme was one there, was associated with that. They've developed it, they've provided it, they've borne the cost of it, in essence, and therefore, you know, they're not actually a bike provider, they're actually an advertiser. And so it's trying to get an extension to the project using the proprietary system. It's been the bulk of the negotiations.
I was on the council in 2009, Dublin City Council, when we launched the bikes, and within 3 months I think we were moving to try and negotiate for an extension to the scheme because it had proved so successful so quickly.
Yes.
So we're hitting in now into 2013 and we're still in those negotiations. Does the NTA have a role in those?
Well, I think we've assisted the City Council by, we actually funded some economic advice to them. KPMG, they brought in KPMG to assist them in negotiations. I don't think they've been negotiating since 2009. I think basically that restarted about 12, 15 months ago. You know, there was been a gap period, then it restarted again. It has been slower. We had set aside money last year. We were disappointed it hadn't come to conclusion last year. But we understand that it is going to come to conclusion next 3 months, a confirmation that they're going to, you know, agree to the extension scheme or they're not. If they don't agree to the extension scheme, well then we have to look at that scenario. We may have to look at a parallel bike scheme that we will develop ab initio ourselves and fund that for Dublin City Council.
I'm really against the idea of a parallel bike scheme. I think it'll have massive operational difficulties, but at the same time I recognise that all the cards are in JC Deco's hands here because they operate the existing scheme. Just going back to the 5 million amount, so we've put aside 5 million for the next 2 years, and that's for the rollout of the extra stations in the phase.
That's right. Yes. Yes.
Including those extra bikes. I think it's going to be 5,000 bikes in
Yes.
40 stations. Is that right?
I couldn't give you the exact figures now. Perhaps you can take that.
It's actually about, I think, 1,000 extra bikes at about 40 extra stations.
Extra bikes, 40 extra stations. And then what's JC? If we're spending the money on that, if the Irish taxpayer is paying for the bikes and the stations, the contract we're negotiating with JC Deco is to then run the bikes then over the period of 10, 15, 20 years. Is that it?
The remainder of their contract, which is the contract associated with their advertising rights.
Okay, thanks. Sorry, I actually didn't mean to touch upon Dublin bikes just because it came up in relation to the leap card. The other thing I wanted to mention as well is the rollout of the real-time passenger information and the apps for Dublin Bus and the DART. I think it's been excellent. I mean, I know there's been problems with them, and I know from time to time when I use the bus myself, the information isn't to hand, unfortunately. But I think by and large, it's greatly improved people's experience of public transport, and I'm sure it must have increased numbers using public transport as well. I'd like to talk a bit, just initially, about the taxi regulator. That office came into your office in 2012?
1st of January 2011.
Sorry, 2011. And did all the staff move across as well?
Yes.
How many staff was that?
At the time, they had a mixture of agency staff and actual staffing. They were in the order of 30 at the time.
And then staff costs then were borne by the NTA?
That's right. They moved into our reporting, and they would be captured in this annual report, annual accounts of 2011.
And so I take it then the money that the Department of Transport was paying out to the taxi regulator's office then gets paid to you to cover those staff costs.
In fact, it was funded off the licensing income There were no grant payments to the taxi office.
Okay.
It was funded off the licensing income, and there was a taxi surplus available, and that was being utilised because there was a deficit between licensing income and the expenditure of the office.
Okay. And so there's the building that taxi regulator was in on Fitzwilliam Square. We're still renting that building.
We're still renting that building, yes.
What's the annual rent?
It's 170,000 euros. And it's still being used. We just this month we've moved across the bulk of the staff from that office over to our office in Harcourt Lane because the OPW vacated the floor in ours and gave an opportunity to consolidate the whole organisation. So we have all our organisation essentially just consolidating into one premises. And at the same time, we've actually, through the OPW, found a public sector body who's going to take over the Fitzwilliam Square premises from the summer.
Which public sector body is
The
that?
National Council for Curriculum and Assessment.
National Council for Curriculum Assessment. They're coming in the summer.
That's right.
How big is the building?
The building accommodates about 35 staff. I can't give you the square area, but that's roughly the size.
And the National Council Curriculum Assessment
That matches their numbers very well, yes. And they're located currently in Merrion Square, so it's lease is up.
We don't know. Oh, the lease is up.
That lease is up, and the OPW is. They're going to be able to reduce their costs by moving to our premises, and we're going to be able to reduce costs by about 250,000 a year by renting this Fitzwilliam Square premise, consolidating all our, say, reception, security, heating and lighting, and IT all on our side.
Great. And then in terms of the rent review on that, there's a rent review every 5 years on the lease on the Fitzwilliam building.
Yes.
It's going to be 2014.
Yes, that's right.
What will happen then with the rent review?
Well, as I understand, it's an upward-only rent review lease, and I don't know what will happen then. The way we're doing the kind of sublease to the National Council Curriculum Assessment is in conjunction with the OPW is going to be a fixed. It's going to be a fixed rental out for either 5 or 11 years. We've yet to conclude that agreement. So I suppose we as an organisation, if there's a rent review increase, we'll suffer. The kind of extra cost of that. We won't be able to pass it on.
Go back a step, sorry, you were saying about the OPW's involvement.
Yeah, well, the OPW is essentially involved in all our premises stuff. When we were set up in December 2009, we subsumed the Dublin Transportation Office, which was located in an OPW leased building in Irish Life Centre. The OPW want to exit their whole arrangement, the Irish Life, and then we needed extra space we took staff in from the department and the RPA, and we went to the OPW and said, have you any buildings in the state stock either that you own or that you're renting that are available? And they had Harcourt Lane available for us, so we moved into that. That's an OPW held lease with the prime owner, and then we just pay the OPW. And similarly, the OPW then looked across the public sector for our Fitzwilliam Square premises. Could they find a public body that would take it?
Then, if there is an increase in the rent on Fitzwilliam Square, you bear the cost of that?
But where the agreement that we're doing with National Council for Curriculum Assessment via the OPW is going to be fixed for 5 or 11 years.
It's their lease for 5 or 11 years.
Yes,
so
that's right.
Then whoever owns the building in Fitzwilliam Square, if they increase,
bear the cost. I mean, the balance here is that rentals are very, very cheap across, commercial office rentals, and the National Council Curriculum Assessment knows what is the value of rental properties, and we've had an independent valuation of that done. The OPW is doing broker between the two parties and agreeing the rent.
and so the building Fitzwilliam Square is whoever the landlords are. Are they the have they any other buildings that have been leased out by government departments?
I couldn't tell you. I couldn't tell you.
But in terms of the contract, when it comes to sitting down on it, is it very much up to them in terms of what they can fix the lease at, or?
Well,
what's the break clause position for us, if necessary?
well, there's no break clause in for, say, us as an authority. What we inherited was a lease that went out to 2024 with upward-only rent reviews at 5-year cycles. So, that's what we've inherited, and we've tried to manage that as best we can to offload it and consolidate and reduce costs.
They increased the lease costs on you and the NTA. We're stuck with that.
Yeah, we were stuck with it, yes, because it is a contract that the Commission for Taxi Regulation has entered into.
It's not a great position to be in.
Well, we prefer not to be in a position and not have the opportunity, but, you know, we try and affect savings in other ways. You know, this is just a fact of life, really.
Do we know why that particular building was chosen by the taxi regulator at the time?
I have no idea why it was chosen.
Would that be on record? In terms of the negotiations or the different buildings that might have been looked at or the contract negotiations or...
They may have records for that, you know.
But if there were records in the taxi regulator's office, they'd be in your records.
There would be, yes. I've never looked into that.
Would you mind looking into it?
Yes.
I'd be interested to see how that lease came to be negotiated and why that particular building was chosen and why that particular rent was set, etc. The various details if they're there, because...
What I can find, whether there is that background, all I do know is I have the lease and the final deal as such. I don't know if I can say that there is other material.
Just given the potential liability, it'd be good to know how we got ourselves in that position. I know circumstances have changed since the lease was negotiated in the first instance, but just to look back and see,
yes,
and it could be helpful. In relation then to, so prior to the taxi regulator moving into the NTA, that operation was essentially self-funded through taxi licensing, was it?
It wasn't actually self-funded from taxi licensing. Their accounts for their final year of operation 2010 showed that they dipped into the surplus, the surplus that had been built up when the very big payments we made and the big explosion in the industry to the tune of 2.8 million euros. So that it was essentially underfunded from licensing income and reliant on the surplus.
The licensing income that comes in annually, do we have a figure for that?
Yes. The licensing income in 2011 was 6.4 million.
That covers the public service vehicles and the associated vehicle licenses, is that right?
That's right.
Is that money ring fenced then for the taxi industry, or?
Well, that comes into the authority just as bus licensing income comes into the authority as well from a bus licensing function, and then it's spent as
spent really, you spend it
collected essentially. Yeah.
Okay.
Regarding our funding, in my briefing paper I sent to the committee in advance, when the Department of Transport and Finance were negotiating the setting up of our organisation in 2008, they said that when we subsumed the Commission for Taxi Regulation, we needed to rely on their surplus for quite a number of years, and we've been underfunded administratively from the start on the basis that we were going to gradually dip into this taxi surplus. Okay. So we need that generally for our administrative expenses.
That was for the first couple of years, though, wasn't it?
Yeah, the idea was for the first couple of years because the expectation was that it would be gone by that stage, the taxi surplus. But actually we've managed it and we still have 15 million available and we want to...
And that all?
No, I mean, we're not free to spend it all. What we're doing each year is we're keeping to a minimum the amount that we dip into that surplus. So it was 1.9 million in 2011 in these accounts. I think it's 2.3 in 12, and projecting forward next year it'll be 3.5 million with a whole series of increased costs in taxi regulation and probably a drop in industry income. So it is gradually diminishing, the order of 2 to 3 million per year, but it should be able to take us out for quite a number of years in covering administrative expenses. Our salaries, there's an under provision for our salaries, for example, and our general costs.
Dipping into the surplus just for the taxi element of the
Just for the organisation. In essence, it's all subsumed into the organisation. We run it as one integrated organisation.
And then who decides the amount that you'll dip into it by, in terms of whether it be 2.9 or 3.5?
It comes from our authority as such. We do a budget projection at the start of the year. We show what the income is going to be in the Oireachtas grants, what the licensing income is going to be, what is the cost basis, what we're spending it on, and then we target a budget for the year. We monitor that budget target. So it's determined at authority at board level.
So if you're doing a projection forward for the year, towards the end of the year, you notice the shortfalls coming through. You then decide to dip into the surplus.
Yeah, well, yes, that's correct. Well, that's the only mechanism we have to fund, say, like the 1.9 million deficit was that the deficit occurred and the money was drawn down from,
safety net that you have in terms of the funding.
That's correct, yes.
And 1.9 million as a percentage of the total spend of the organisation is about what in terms of
Well, we spent, in 2011, we spent 512 million. So it's a small portion, 0.2%.
Just keeping on the issue of taxis just for a moment, in relation to the ranks and racism, it's something that is constantly brought to my attention. The racism that is happening between taxi drivers in Dublin. What's the authorities' responsibility there?
Well, of course, like yourself, we'd be shocked at any racism occurring. The problem there is a matter of control and enforcement. Is you get a lot of anecdote about it. So we don't know the actual level of it. And secondly is the regulation. We don't actually have a regulation that can cover a matter like that. That covers more generally by other legislation about, equality of treatment, etc. So we don't actually have a regulation about racist behaviour of a taxi driver. That would be one that we report then.
Controlling ranks, I mean, the taxi ranks, you've got a responsibility there for how they're operated, I suppose.
Yeah.
So, I mean,
in accordance with the regulations, which is that people have to be be within the rank situation when the queue have to be available for hire, etc. But that's where the regulations go and what the Act allows us to do.
and who monitors those regulations or who enforces them? Who goes? Do you have a team going to the ranks and looking at behaviour?
Yes, we have. Yes, so we've a team of 9 people, an enforcement team of 9 people, specially trained enforcement team, and then we do a lot of joint operations with the Gardaí. So last year we checked out 14,000 vehicles. Actually, checked those out, either stopped or at joint operations or individually, and then we monitor ranks. To increase the monitoring of taxi ranks, we saw that a problem in 2011. We contracted in some extra resources through our contractor SGS, who do our general vehicle licensing, and they have provided us a special compliance team that monitor the key taxi ranks that have been providing problems to see if there's appropriate behaviour, etc. on those as regards the regulations, proper queuing, etc.
St. Stephen's Green taxi rank be one of those?
Well, there's a range of them. I mean, people say that the O'Connell Street rank is one that has led to a lot of problems, and the guards have been very actively involved in that area. It's very close to Store Street. They've been very actively involved in that. And actually, the guards are one of the key parties in this kind of management on street, also of the behaviour of taxi people beside our enforcement staff. One could imagine that, of course, a guard has much more effective powers, really, in dealing with people on the street than an enforcement officer of our authority.
Have complaints been made to your office about Irish-only driver ranks and foreign national-only driver ranks operating in the city?
Not actual formal complaints, but again, there's anecdotal talk that there are ranks that are reserved for, particularly the talk is of the O'Connell Street rank, that is one. But it's very hard to get the bottom of
The O'Connell Street rank?
that. It's not that people who are kind of not Irish nationals, or either that they are Irish nationals but they aren't, say, white Irish nationals, are being excluded from using those ranks. Now, again, it's very hard to get the bottom of the anecdotal information.
You're doing something about it?
I don't want to claim that we are doing anything about it because our powers are very limited in that regard. Perhaps Hugh, you take up that point for me.
Well, we do a certain amount of enforcement activities at various ranks around the place. Now, with 8 enforcement officers covering the whole country 24 hours a day, there's a limit to what you can actually cover. But the various ranks, including the likes of ranks on O'Connell Street and elsewhere, would be visited on an intermittent basis, and whatever offences we detect in accordance with our legislation, we can deal with those. And on top of that, then the Gardaí will give particular attention to various places where they have reports on from time to time as well.
I don't know where it's sanctioned a taxi driver for racist behaviour? Or investigated a taxi driver for allegations of racist behaviour?
It's the formal, actually, either a formal complaint in that regard. We would investigate all complaints. If we had a formal complaint, we would have investigated it. I suppose it would be the complaint regards their behaviour with the customer, matters like that.
But you're the regulator for the industry, and we know that there's a particular rank on Connaught Street which might have particular problems in relation to racism between taxi drivers, and certain drivers being excluded because of their perceived ethnicity or colour or nationality. Why not focus your attention on O'Connell Street, have someone down there the entire time to ensure that that's not happening, and where it is seen to be happening, where there is a particular taxi driver or group of them excluding others, call them up on it?
Well, I think to say is to what we do regulate or what we do manage is that the rank operates normally, and a taxi driver pulls up and there's a space there, they're allowed to use it. So when we're doing the monitoring of it, that gets picked up on that. So that's a kind of sideways way of dealing with the issue. What I'm saying is that under our Act and the way we're set up, we actually can't get into the area of, that there may be racist interactions between taxi drivers as such, and their relationships.
There's this kind of mob-like behaviour where certain people or groups of people are controlling ranks. These are meant to be ranks accessible to every single taxi driver who wants to pull up and take a passenger from them, but they can't because it's a white-only rank.
Yeah, well, they can pull up, and they're monitored, and they're ensured that they can pull up. I think.
Are you ensuring that? That's my point.
Well, we are ensuring it, and I say that's why it's a kind of sideways way of dealing with the issue. We're ensuring that the rank is available. Taxi driver pulls up, taxi driver can use the rank, and then nobody can stop that taxi driver using the rank because the rank's available. And so if our enforcement team is there, that's ensured. What I can't deal with is that there may be sub-issues around the industry, maybe frightening off people even going to the rank and stuff like that. That's a broader issue, and I wouldn't like to claim that we are dealing with it when we're not.
Why not try and deal with it, though? Why not, implement a program for, improving integration between taxi drivers and, knowledge awareness, different courses that are undertaken by other departments and in other areas of Irish life to help with these kinds of issues? I mean, why not take it on as your role?
I think that's a fair point. It's something that we will look at. We had looked at it working with Dublin City Council, has kind of a strategy also about, fairness, equality of treatment, and partnering with them because these issues are particularly in the Dublin area. So I think your point is taken. Let us go off and see, can we develop something that would encourage integration or work with other authorities who are doing it already.
You should, and I think you should take it upon yourselves and you should discuss at the board that it is your responsibility to deal with this, because every time I get into a taxi and every time I'm out in Dublin at night, I see it all the time, and I hear the complaints, and I get them to my office from all sorts of people and from every walk of life. And I think it's time we got proactive on this and said that this is within our industry that we regulate, that we control, and we've got to do something about it. I mean, we had this campaign a few years ago where taxi drivers were even marking their cars saying Irish taxi driver, and I think they used the tricolour to show that, as in that was a good thing, that they'd be discriminating in that way. And I didn't hear anyone from the taxi regulator's office doing anything about it at all at the time. This has been hanging around for years, and I think it's time for you as the authority to get proactive. Go to the minister, look for extra funding if that's required, or look for the mandate, or just take it upon yourselves as a board to tackle this issue. It's an important one, and it's going to lead to serious problems, I think, in the future at ranks in terms of violence or something else.
No, I think your point's well made, and we'll go off and we'll see what we can do this year on some measures there. I mean, education raising measures or whatever that we can do and work with other bodies, yes.
Thank you. Thank you, Chair.
Deputy Fleming.
Thank you, Chairman, and Mr. Murphy and colleagues are welcome here today. I won't dwell on all the meetings we had with you during the year in your office and in Durrow about the bus route being taken off the Ableeks, Durrow and Johnstown and Urlingford areas on the Dublin Cork route, and the reduction in the services on the Limerick route, which seems to be happening all over the country at the moment. So thank you for your assistance in so much as you could do on that, and the private bus that came on to replace the CIE is still operating, obviously in financial difficulty because there's no subsidy for them. We're talking about public service obligation. They don't qualify for that, or funding from for travel passes from social welfare, but I hope they can continue, and I hope that people use these services. Just in general, a few general questions first. Are you subject to freedom of information?
Yes.
And were there many requests during the year? I know the accounts are probably 100 pages. It didn't jump out at me how many requests you got. It could be there I don't know, just ballpark. Were there many requests or?
I couldn't give you an answer to that
You might send
right now, but I think we actually operate a principle that somebody doesn't have to go to the FOI through the FOI process with us. If people want information, we volunteer it out, and we put a lot of information on our website, and I just, in regard to information and the kind of performance CIE companies, we put all the quarterly performance reports up on our website so people can see how they're performing, which is a first. Before we were set up, people didn't have any idea how.
Just on your website, very important. I think during the time of the year we spoke about, it's just difficult. I know you have a list on your website of everybody, private operator in the country that has a license, but I don't think all their timetables are on your website, and the public who are looking for local knowledge might tell somebody if there's a bus service license from town A to town B in some province or other, but I don't think your website had, when I was dealing with it last year, the timetables of all these private operators, because you have license issued, and due to commercial activities, some of those buses aren't operating, even though you have a license, and you probably may not know they're not operating. So if you have a mechanism in place to check that when you give a license, because I'll come to that in your appendix about performance monitoring on the major companies in Dublin, to verify that where you have a license issued, that the bus is actually on the ground, even though you have a license on your website. And you might talk to me about getting those timetables up there, because you talk about your journey planner thing, and I know that's a little bit scant, but tell me where you are, but I believe you need to give a bit more energy to that so that the people can find out. Yes. Maybe let you know if the buses aren't there.
Yeah, well, you're right in that when we were talking last year about the Doro service, that it wasn't so easy to find timetables. But since the journey planner isn't scant, actually, Deputy, there's a huge amount of information in the journey planner. So if you go in and you say, I want to look at, say, a service in Doro to somewhere, and you click in the journey, it'll give you the operator, but you can actually get the timetable of the operator on our website as well. They're there. They're all there.
That's great.
And that exercise in launching that journey plan, there was an exercise in going to all the private operators that we license, say, give us kind of an amnesty kind of arrangement. Give us your latest timetable. You may not be operating to license. We'll regularize the license and let's get the timetables up. And that's where we did that exercise. But there are some operators who don't operate to the license, and this year we're doing an increased enforcement on those, and we're going to use some of our taxi team who are around the country, to do the licensing checks as well on the bus side.
That's important, because I think, especially in this day and age with CIE, and I use the phrase abandoning so many rural areas in the interest, and I'm critical of CIE. Like, I was listening to people in Roscommon and Morning Ireland yesterday, and the service to their towns are being replaced by a service to Dublin Airport. Everything seems to be to Dublin Airport. Every route in the country, if it doesn't start or end at an airport, the people in between don't count. So there is going to be a lot of denuding of public transport buses, CIE buses. There are expressway facilities around the country, and it's important that we do have a proper timetable and any alternative that you are licensing out there. The only criticism I had, and it's important, Chairman, was that I feel, and it's probably a legislation issue that we might come back when we're reviewing this, is when you get a request in for a license for a route, you're obliged to see who else has a license on that route, and you don't want to license somebody to go 10 minutes ahead of the bus that's already there, because it would undermine that. But there seems to be the existing license person on the route seems to have quite a bit of control and power, or not influence in the system, and I don't know where the public interest fully comes into your licensing system when you get a request for these routes. So just give a comment on that.
Yeah, well, yes, we do consider who's already on the route, because, as you say, there's no point licensing somebody to come 5 minutes before the current bus that's there. You end up with that on-the-road competition. You end up with somebody putting somebody else out of business. What we do is look at, are there time slots available, somebody else could come in and add services to the public. And nobody has a right to the licenses. One of the things, they have 3-year licenses, but we made it quite clear in our guidelines we set up is don't expect that you have a permanent right to a license. You know, if you're not operating appropriately, or if somebody comes in with a much better offering, say for example wheelchair accessible bus or much lower fares, and it's better for the public, that person will get that slot. Now, there's probably very few places anyway where this real issue of competition is critical, and it's probably the intercity market, which is kind of the most lucrative one for private coach operators, where getting these kind of valuable slots of a half hour are important. But actually, we've had very few recent applications on those. I think the companies that are operating there, that there's a satisfactory provision. So there is the public interest is considered. If we didn't consider the public interest, you would end up with a willy-nilly situation where somebody, say, providing a very good service, operating out in rural Ireland, fixed times, and somebody come in maybe on a loss-making basis, hoovering up their market by coming in 5 minutes earlier or something like that across their slots.
On public service obligation, you have a figure of 265 million paid out to the there in Dublin Bus and Bus Éireann. Can private operators get any of that if they're... Is that available to private operators, to public service, or is it strictly for CIE group companies?
The concept is that, you know, if subsidies were available, let's say, for public transport, they could go to whoever you're contracted with. So let's take the general concept is that, you know, that could go to other companies, okay? The reality is that that amount of money is needed for the services those companies are currently providing. This year now, you mentioned the Douro service, and last year we tendered that, and we tendered on the basis that the operator would come into contract with us just on the basis of the fares revenue. We've been advised by the operator that he cannot survive on the basis of the fares revenue, and we've advised he's pulling out in February period, and we're going to advertise that contract again with the subsidy. So we're going to make available subsidy to that tender competition.
Where did this subsidy? That's excellent news, and I'm sure there are people, and it's excellent news for us in Laois and the Roscommon people who I heard in Morning Ireland and all over the country. Have you much of a fund for this?
We don't have...
I think rural communities would love to hear this bit of news now this morning. There is a PSO subsidy now for some of these new routes. This is new.
It's new, yes. It'll be a first time, and it's a modest amount of money, and we couldn't replicate it across the country. The reason we're doing it on this service is that we consider these were significant towns.
The strength of representation.
Well, the strength of representation was strong, but the points were well made, I think.
Yeah, I know, it's a learning experience for us all. Okay, and that's good. Just briefly then on the taxis, just so as I understand, and I don't know, is it you issued the taxis licences for all of Ireland now?
Right.
So, you might send us the information if you have it there. Can you send to us the number of licences you have operating on a county-by-county basis?
We could, yes.
Yeah,
yes.
Because, for example, and Chairman, and you know I'm not normally parochial, but it's a typical example. Taxi drivers complain to me in Portlaoise that there are 194 licences in Portlaoise. Now, there's not a livelihood for half of that. There's a livelihood for a lot. I just wondered, you just keep issuing them. Is there any ceiling? I'm not talking about going back to the old system of having a ceiling, but somewhere along the line, and this is really what, in terms of taxi ranks in other cities outside, have you a role in deciding with the local authority where the ranks should be? Is it a local authority function? And let's say a town who doesn't have a taxi service, because there are lots of Ireland where there aren't taxis. Maybe there's the Hackney service, a guy can ring up the local town. But I know some towns that have taxi services. Maybe they're not official, I don't know. But have you view, how do you decide, is it a matter for the local authority or for you? Who decides if town A with a population of 4,000 people merits a taxi service, 2 taxis, or who decides this?
Well, that's going to the heart of the issue. The way that the Taxi Regulation Act was set up in 2003 and the way the market was is that it isn't. It's an open market subject to certain regulatory controls. Now, since 2009, I think, when it was brought in that people could only get wheelchair accessible licences because there was a big gap in the provision of wheelchair taxis, there's been a big drop in numbers coming into the sector. So, for example, in 2011, there were only approximately 80 licenses issued, and they would broadly be for wheelchair accessible taxis. And 2012, there were only 44 or something in that order licenses issued. So there's very few licenses currently being issued because it's restricted to wheelchair accessible taxi licenses. And wheelchair accessible taxis have a higher cost, to provide the special.
You can't process an application for an ordinary taxi then?
Not at the moment. No, there isn't. Sure, isn't available to get a new taxi license. Well,
I know we probably created that rule in the Oireachtas here, but
there's an awful lot of taxis in Ireland at the moment. We've 23,000 vehicle licenses. And what we're trying to do is target the sector of people with disabilities. There's a big under-provision of taxis that are capable of carrying.
Back to my question, a town out there with several thousand of a population with no taxi, who decides should they get a taxi? Because has there to be a taxi rank provided by the local authority if there's to be a taxi? Explain how the system works, because some towns are looking for it, and I don't know where the hold-up is, but the local authority seems to often talk about these issues. I don't know.
It really depends on the individuals who want to go into the business. It's
bypass the local authority and go straight to you. So
they come to us. They come to us for a wheelchair accessible license, and if they have the appropriate driver license and they have the appropriate vehicle, they'll get a wheelchair accessible license. They don't need a taxi rank in the town. The management of the kind of street space is a function of the local authority, so they can come to us. And we did grant aid in 2011. And I think in 2012, we grant-aided the provision of wheelchair accessible taxis, and we brought in maybe another 50 or 60 vehicles into the fleet.
One question kind of linked to the public service obligation that you pay generally to the CIE group of companies. They also get subsidy for their travel passes from the Department of Social Protection.
Yes.
I think that's 60 million or 70 in that type of rate.
Yes,
it's significantly less than what you pay. But what kind of coordination is there between you and Social Protection to see that you're not duplicating the taxpayers' money, Social Protection paying money for travel pass to Bus Éireann in respective routes that have been built up, and you're providing a subsidy? Is there a two-way meeting between you and Social Protection? Because really the money is ultimately for the one purpose, is to subsidise the public service obligation. Is there a case for those two funds to be managed by one or other of the organisations? You understand my question?
Yes, it's a good point. Well, there's nothing really falling in the gaps at the moment in the management of it. I mean, Social Protection give payments to not only the CIE companies, they give it to the RPA and they give it to private bus operators. They froze that process in around 2009, 2010, and any new people coming in with licenses didn't get avail of that. And there's a review undergoing at the moment between Social Protection, Department of Transport, and Graham sits on that national committee, looking at where are we going with the subsidy of free travel. We get reporting from the operators that we subsidise of the amount of money that they're getting in that subsidy component. So when I mentioned that we know all the revenues and costs when they come into us, our fares increases, that is, we know that money that's coming in, we're aware of the sum that they're getting.
Okay, can I just ask you specifics on your financial statements then? I see on page 41, I was intrigued to see that you earned bank interest of €534,941, and I see on your balance sheet on page 36 you were sitting on a bank balance at the end of 31st to the 12th 2011 of over 20 million cash in the bank. That's a fabulous amount of money and the shortage of money in the country, and you've 20 million sitting there earning interest. How much interest what interest rate do you get? And then I'm also intrigued somewhere else in the accounts to see that you had bank charges of 67,692. I don't understand how an organisation with 20 million cash in the bank, earning deposit interest of 534,000, is incurring bank charges, and I think that might be mentioned on page 46, bank charges of 67,692. Just explain how is that all happening, or who can explain that? Because
right.
You can understand how they look a bit unusual to me, that
we got a 3% interest rate, essentially, broadly, on the monies. That surplus has reduced, so by the end of the year, at the end of 2011, the taxi surplus reduced down to 17.6 million, and by the end of 2012 down to 15.4 million. The bank charges are...
What are those figures again? 70 million?
By the end of 2011, that taxi surplus that we were availing of had gone down to 17.6 million, and by the end of 2012, the monies that we were holding from that down to 15.4 million. So it's gradually depleting.
Over 30 million then we have come back in the bank.
No. That money that would be in the bank either would have been broadly the taxi surplus and maybe some money on a cash flow basis pending a payment.
Well, I might help you on this by saying that in your balance sheet, cash in hand, on page 36, you have 20 million in the bank account. And I go down to the bottom of the same page, and you have under the income and expenditure account, you have the 17 million in the bank account, note 18, which is on page, whichever page it is there. It's and that relates to the money from the taxi regulator on page 54. It seems to be an additional amount.
Yeah.
So you have, in the top half of your balance sheet, you have 20 million cash sitting in the bank from your day-to-day activities, and on the bottom line of your balance sheet, you have this other 17 million unspent money from the taxi regulator. So you've over 30 million cash sitting in the bank. When you take the two of them together.
No, perhaps Philip would take that.
Yeah.
I can take that. Actually, no, the order of the cash deposits was around 20 million. And, at a high level kind of split, we had 17.5 million, which was residual cash from the taxi surplus. The other 2.5... No, that's within the 20. If I was to break down the 20, 17.5 would be related to the taxi surplus that we assumed into the NTA on the 1st of January 2011. The other 2.5 is essentially working capital cash that we manage. So we get money in, we pay money out for various things, creditors, grants, and so on and so forth. So the 2.5, if you like, is committed. The 17.5 is the surplus that we're carrying forward into 2012, and that's related specifically to the taxi surplus.
Okay, so you're still a cash-rich organisation. Because it's interesting, we've seen here in the past year, we've seen some of the third-level institutions coming in here, realising, and they're screaming for money all the time, and they're sitting on tens of millions in their bank account. We have people complaining about taxi fares and the cost of transport, and we find you have 20 million as the regulator authority sitting in your bank account. I'm just saying, Chairman, there seems to be a lot of millions, tens of millions of cash sitting in various agencies, bank accounts around the country, when the country seems to be very strapped for cash. You can understand people find it a little bit unusual given the tight financial situation we're in.
Bank charges, definitely.
Yeah,
I think
yeah,
important
so.
point, so perhaps Philip will take that one as well.
The bank charges, and you'll see from the accounts, they increased from 2010 to 2011 quite sizably. The reason for that is because we assimilated the taxi regulator. So there's a lot of actual transactions that go through the taxi licensing business. So the various industry users would ring up to renew licenses, they would pay their license fees and so on, and they incur merchant fees with the banks if they pay by credit card and so on and so forth. If you were to look at it, the average kind of fee that we would pay would be 1% on each kind of transaction that was made. So the reason is not related to the bank balance that we have. It's more a transactional type charge related to the taxi industry.
You spent 17.8 million for new bus air and buses during the year. How many buses? Tell us what's approximately
About 60.
the cost? 400,000.
About
over 330,000.
The buses. Is that the expressway or no, the bus air? Are they double-decker buses?
double deckers and single deckers, and they were all for public subsidised services.
Double-decker bus cost.
Approximately 300,000.
And the expressway one that we see, the single-decker, is roughly the same, are they?
We wouldn't fund expressway ones, but the single-decker buses would be a little bit cheaper, 200 and something thousand, approximately.
Other figures on your accounts on page 46 again. I found the ratio unusual. the CNAG had a very modest fee of €17,613, but you have, and it was mentioned earlier by Deputy Ross, the internal audit fees are €84,742, which would show you spending 5 times the amount on your internal audit function as opposed to your external audit function. It would seem a very high ratio, one versus the other.
Our internal auditors perform our external audit functions. I mean, besides the CNAG's function, all the auditing of the local authorities that we grant aid, the transport operators on their capital and their PSO side, an organisation like Antashka that we fund through the Green Schools programme, all that auditing is carried out by the same company.
I'd suggest for your own, I just make a suggestion, recategorise that, because one